The untold truth about the Battle of the Alamo. What really happened at the Alamo? Was it a hopeless fight for freedom, or a tragic mistake that only became legend afterward? Did Davy Crockett fall with his rifle in hand? Or do recent discoveries reveal a far different ending? And why does this one small fortress in Texas still spark fierce debate almost 200 years later? For generations, the story has been told as one of pure heroism. Brave men holding out to the last, refusing to surrender, creating a legend that shaped Texas and America. But how much of that is truth, and how much is myth? Could it be that the tales we grew up hearing, the line in the sand, the last shots, the fearless stance, never happened the way we imagine? Later in this video, we'll look at controversial theories, surprising discoveries, and even newly examined documents that might change the way you see the Alamo forever. But first, let's step back into 1836 and ask the question, why did this crumbling old mission matter so much that men were willing to die for it? Part 1. Why the Alamo mattered. Have you ever wondered why the Alamo mattered so much? Why did a small, crumbling mission in Texas become the center of a brutal fight that people still talk about nearly 2 centuries later? Was it really worth dying for? Or was its importance blown out of proportion after the smoke cleared? Let's find out together. The Alamo began as a Spanish mission in the early 1700s. It was meant to bring Christianity to the native population and secure Spanish claims in Texas. By the 1830s, the mission had long since lost its religious role and had become a fortress. Thick walls, a central chapel, and surrounding barracks made it useful for defense, even if it wasn't originally built for war. It sat near the town of San Antonio de Bejar, which was the key settlement in Mexican Texas. Whoever controlled San Antonio controlled the heart of Texas, and whoever held the Alamo controlled San Antonio. That is why this battered compound suddenly became the most valuable piece of real estate in the Texas Revolution. At the time, Mexico was in turmoil. After gaining independence from Spain in 1821, Mexico struggled with unstable governments, shifting leaders, and deep divides. Antonio López de Santa Anna rose to power and declared himself the strongman who could bring order. He wanted firm control over Texas, where thousands of Anglo-American settlers had moved in under earlier Mexican agreements. Many of those settlers wanted more freedom than Mexico allowed. They resisted central authority, demanded local rule, and in some cases wanted to join the United States. Santa Anna saw rebellion brewing and resolved to crush it before it spread. For the Texians, as the settlers called themselves, the Alamo represented both opportunity and danger. On one hand, holding it meant blocking Santa Anna's advance northward. On the other, it was isolated and hard to defend. Some Texian leaders even suggested abandoning the Alamo. Sam Houston, who would later lead Texian forces to victory at San Jacinto, advised falling back and preserving men and supplies for better ground. But the defenders on site decided otherwise. Pride, stubbornness, and a belief in making a stand kept them in place. Think about that for a moment. Would you have stayed in a weak fort, knowing thousands of soldiers were marching your way? Or would you have pulled back to fight another day? This decision alone shaped history. The Alamo mattered strategically, but it also mattered symbolically. For the Texians, refusing to give it up meant showing resolve. They knew they were badly outnumbered. They knew Santa Anna commanded thousands of well-armed troops. Still, to abandon the fort would have looked like cowardice. To hold it meant defiance. That defiance, whether wise or foolish, created the legend that followed. On Santa Anna's side, the Alamo mattered for opposite reasons. He saw it as a chance to make an example. By smashing the Texian rebels at the Alamo, he believed he could frighten the rest of Texas into obedience. No mercy, no compromise, no prisoners. This was his way of saying Mexico's central authority would not be challenged. In Santa Anna's view, the Alamo was not just a building. It was a stage on which he could display his power. Now let's step back and look at geography. The Alamo stood at a crossroads. Roads from the south, leading up from Mexico, passed through San Antonio. Roads from the east, linking to settlements and the coast, also ran nearby. To move troops or supplies across Texas, you had to go through this region. Whoever held the Alamo could delay or disrupt movement. Even if it was not the strongest fort, it forced Santa Anna to fight for it rather than bypass it. And while he focused on San Antonio, Texian forces elsewhere had time to gather strength. In a way, The defenders' stubbornness bought time for the revolution. But the Alamo's importance was not only military. It was also political. Texian leaders hoped that a bold stand might inspire sympathy in the United States. Remember, many settlers had come from America, and newspapers there followed the events closely. A desperate last stand at the Alamo could stir public opinion and perhaps encourage aid. Later, when news of the slaughter spread, it did just that. Volunteers from the United States streamed into Texas. So while the defenders may not have planned it this way, their stand created a wave of outside support. Inside the Alamo, the defenders likely understood these layers of meaning. Letters written during the siege show both fear and determination. William Travis, the commander, famously wrote an appeal addressed to the people of Texas and all Americans in the world. In it, he pledged to fight to the death and asked for reinforcements. That letter turned the Alamo into more than just a fort. It became a symbol, even before the final battle. Still, we should ask a hard question. Was the Alamo truly worth it? Strategically, it was difficult to hold and almost impossible to defend against Santa Anna's army. Some historians argue that the defenders wasted their lives. Others point out that their resistance delayed Santa Anna and inspired others to rally. Both views hold truth. What we know for certain is that the Alamo mattered in ways far beyond its walls. Have you noticed how sometimes small places carry outsized meaning? Think of Thermopylae in ancient Greece or Gettysburg in the Civil War. The Alamo belongs in that category. A modest mission, with limited value on paper, became a defining symbol because of what people believed it represented. As the siege tightened, both sides understood this. Santa Anna pressed harder because he knew the psychological effect of victory. The defenders held out because they understood the symbolic cost of surrender. The clash of these two views, one bent on crushing rebellion, the other determined to show defiance, is why the Alamo mattered. And so, when we strip away the legends that came later, we see that the Alamo's importance was not only about cannons and walls. It was about pride, politics, and perception. It was a chess piece on the board of war, but also a torch that lit the spirit of rebellion. Now here's the real question for you. If you were there, facing impossible odds, would you have stayed to fight at the Alamo, knowing the likely outcome? Or would you have marched out, saving your life for another battle? That choice, stay or leave, is what gave the Alamo its meaning. The men who stayed made their choice, and history remembered them for it. Part 2. Who fought inside? When you think of the Alamo, who comes to mind first? Is it Davy Crockett with his coonskin cap? Jim Bowie with his knife? William Travis, standing tall, with sword in hand? These names became larger than life. But here's a surprise. Most of the people inside the Alamo were not famous at all. They were ordinary men, and even some families, caught in an extraordinary moment. So who really fought inside those walls? Let's take a closer look. Start with the leaders. William Barrett Travis was just 26 years old. A young lawyer from Alabama, he had moved to Texas after his marriage fell apart. He wasn't a seasoned soldier, but he had ambition. When the Texians needed someone to command the Alamo, Travis stepped forward. He believed in discipline, duty, and sacrifice. His fiery letters show that he wanted the world to know he would fight to the end. Then there was Jim Bowie. He was older, already a legend along the frontier. Known for his hunting knife and rough brawls, Bowie had a reputation as a fighter. But he was also tied to Texas by family. He had married into a prominent Tejano family and saw himself as part of the land. At the Alamo, illness weakened him, but his presence inspired others. His name alone carried weight. And of course, there was Davy Crockett. By 1836, Crockett was a folk hero back in the United States. He had been a frontiersman, a scout, and even a congressman from Tennessee. But politics had left him bitter. After losing his seat, he famously said he was heading to Texas. At the Alamo, he brought a group of Tennessee volunteers. He played fiddle, boosted morale, and took his stand alongside men far less famous than himself. But the Alamo was not only about these three men. In fact, around 200 defenders stood inside the walls. They came from many places and for many reasons. Some were Anglo settlers from the United States, drawn by cheap land and adventure. Others were Tejano, Mexican-born Texans who opposed Santa Anna's central rule. This mix is often forgotten, but it mattered. Men like Juan Seguin, a Tejano officer, fought fiercely for Texian independence. Seguin himself left the Alamo before the final assault, carrying messages, but his men stayed and died inside. Their sacrifice showed that the fight was not simply Anglos versus Mexicans. It was a battle over freedom and control that divided communities. Have you ever noticed how stories often forget the ordinary people? That's true with the Alamo. Behind the famous names stood blacksmiths, farmers, and shopkeepers. Men like Jacob Walker, a settler who left behind a wife and child, or Gregorio Esparza, a Tejano defender whose body was given a proper burial, unlike most others. Their names rarely appear in textbooks, but they bled for the same cause. There were also a few families inside. Women and children took shelter during the siege. Susanna Dickinson, the wife of defender Almoron Dickinson, survived and later gave a harrowing account of the battle. Her young daughter Angelina was with her. When the final assault came, Santa Anna spared them, sending them away as witnesses. Their survival gave the outside world a vivid picture of what had happened inside the Alamo. Why did these people stay? Not all for the same reasons. Some believed deeply in liberty and independence. Others wanted land and opportunity in Texas. Some were simply trapped by circumstance. Once Santa Anna's army surrounded the fort, leaving was nearly impossible. And yet, in the days before the final attack, Travis did give men the chance to leave. Most stayed. That choice turned them from settlers into martyrs. Think for a moment. What would you have done? Would you have walked away, knowing the odds? Or would you have chosen to stay, standing beside men you barely knew? That decision defined each person inside the Alamo. The diversity among the defenders also matters. About 24 came from Europe. Some had arrived only recently, chasing adventure. A few were even from as far away as England, Ireland, and Germany. Imagine traveling across the ocean, only to die in a dusty mission in Texas. Their stories remind us that the Alamo was more than a local fight. It had a global draw, fueled by dreams of freedom and fortune. Even age varied widely. The youngest defender was said to be around 16. The oldest was in his 60s. Some were seasoned fighters, while others had barely held a rifle. Yet when the cannons roared, all faced the same fate. Here's something else worth noting. Not every man inside was committed to independence at the start. Some joined the rebellion reluctantly. Others may have been seeking pay as volunteers. Still, once the siege began, personal motives mattered less. They became one band of defenders, bound by survival and a shared enemy outside the walls. And let's not forget the enslaved people who were present. One of them, a man named Joe, was William Travis's servant. Joe survived the final battle and later told his account. He described Travis's courage but also revealed the terror inside the fort. His testimony became one of the few first-hand accounts we still have. So when you picture the Alamo, don't see only Crockett, Bowie, and Travis. Picture nearly 200 souls, each with a story. Picture settlers with families, Tejano fighting for their land, volunteers from far-off states, even foreigners from across the sea. Together, they formed a patchwork garrison that stood against overwhelming odds. The Alamo mattered not just because of where it stood, but because of who stood inside. They were young and old, famous and forgotten, brave and terrified. They were not all heroes in the way legends claim. Some were adventurers, some were dreamers, some were desperate. But when the gates closed, they became one. And their choice to stay turned a crumbling mission into the most famous battleground in Texas history. Part 3. Life during the siege. What was it really like inside the Alamo during those 13 long days? We know the final attack was fierce, but what about the waiting, the tension, the daily grind? Did the defenders hold steady, or did fear gnaw at them with every passing hour? Let's step inside the walls and see. The siege began on February 23, 1836, when Santa Anna's army appeared on the horizon. Imagine being inside the Alamo that morning. Dust clouds rise in the distance. Soon you see banners, cannons, and thousands of troops. The defenders had fewer than 200 men. At once, they realized they were trapped. There was no way out. Life under siege meant scarcity. Food quickly became a problem. The Alamo wasn't stocked for a long defense. Cornmeal, beans, and dried beef were stretched thin. Water had to be drawn from a nearby acequia, or irrigation ditch, under constant threat of enemy fire. Every sip carried risk. Imagine lifting a bucket, glancing at the walls, and knowing a musket ball might find you. Ammunition was another worry. The defenders had cannons, but not enough powder to keep them firing at full strength. Every shot had to count. Muskets, rifles, and pistols needed lead for bullets, and supplies ran short. Some accounts say defenders melted down scrap metal to make ammunition. Survival depended on ingenuity as much as courage. And what about morale? William Travis tried to keep spirits high. His famous letter, calling for aid, was both a plea and a declaration. He promised to fight until victory or death. Did those words inspire confidence, or did they weigh heavily, reminding everyone of the likely outcome? Probably both. Some men must have felt pride, while others felt dread. At night, the walls echoed with music. Davy Crockett played his fiddle, lifting spirits with songs from Tennessee. Can you picture it? A campfire glow, exhausted men listening to a tune, knowing the enemy sat just beyond the walls. Music became a thin shield against despair. Meanwhile, outside, Santa Anna tightened the noose. His cannons roared daily, blasting the walls. Mexican buglers played calls that signaled no quarter would be given. Every sound reminded the defenders that mercy was off the table. If captured, they would not survive. That knowledge added pressure, but also hardened resolve. Inside, people found small ways to cope. Some repaired walls and mounted cannons. Others wrote letters to loved ones. Travis wrote to rally help. Dickinson begged her family for prayers. Ordinary men scribbled quick notes, hoping they might somehow reach home. Imagine writing your final words by lantern light, knowing they might never be read. The defenders also dealt with illness. Jim Bowie, already weak before the siege, grew worse. Confined to a bed, he still commanded respect. Stories say he issued orders from his sick room, his large knife by his side. For the healthy, infection and fever remained constant threats. In cramped quarters, sickness spread easily. So how did they pass the days? Skirmishes broke the monotony. Mexican troops probed the walls, testing weak spots. Texian sharpshooters fired back. Each exchange reminded both sides that the final storm was coming. Every casualty cut deep because the defenders could not afford losses. And there was fear. Imagine lying awake at night, listening for drums, waiting for the crash of attack. Some men probably prayed. Others cursed their luck. A few may have wondered why they stayed. Yet few left. That choice defined the siege. Women and children added another layer. Susanna Dickinson later recalled the terror. Her baby cried as cannon fire shook the walls. Families huddled together, powerless to change the outcome. For them, the Alamo was not glory. It was survival. Reinforcements were hoped for, but they never came in numbers. A small group from Gonzales slipped through enemy lines, raising the defender count slightly. Their arrival lifted morale for a moment, but everyone knew it wasn't enough. The men at the Alamo were on their own. Each day passed with growing tension. Santa Anna's forces swelled to thousands. His red flag flew, signaling no prisoners would be spared. The defenders understood what that meant. Their only choices were victory or death. Hope faded, but defiance burned. And yet, think about this. Why did more men desert? There was still a chance, at least early on. Travis even allowed those unwilling to stay to leave. Most stayed. That decision turned a desperate defense into a legend. Would you have done the same? By March 5th, the siege had stretched nearly 2 weeks. The defenders were exhausted, low on food, low on water, and nearly out of options. That night, Travis gathered the men. According to legend, he drew a line in the dirt with his sword. He invited anyone willing to stay and die to cross. Did it really happen? Historians debate it, but the story reflects the mood. Almost all crossed. Only a few chose to slip away. The stage was set. Inside the Alamo, fear and fatigue mixed with courage and resolve. Outside, Santa Anna's army prepared for the final assault. 13 days of waiting would end in one furious morning. The defenders knew it was coming. They just didn't know when. And so, life inside the Alamo during the siege was a mix of hunger, fear, and stubborn bravery. Music played against the sound of cannon fire. Letters were written against the backdrop of certain death. Families clung together as soldiers patched walls and melted scrap for bullets. It was ordinary life lived under extraordinary pressure. Later in this video, we'll see what happened when the waiting ended, when the walls finally fell, and when the Alamo became more than a battle. But first, let's hold on to this picture. A weary band of men and families, living day to day, staring down an army they could never beat. Part 4. The Final Assault. Can you imagine waking up to the sound of drums before dawn, knowing it might be your last sunrise? That was the reality for the defenders of the Alamo on March 6, 1836. After nearly 2 weeks of siege, the waiting ended. The storm was coming, and everyone inside the walls knew it. Santa Anna chose the early morning for his attack. Darkness still covered the land, and the air was cool. Around 5:30 a.m., his troops moved into position. Columns of Mexican soldiers marched silently, bayonets fixed, ladders ready. Their orders were clear: overwhelm the Alamo. Take no prisoners. Santa Anna wanted not just a victory, but a statement of power. Inside the Alamo, the defenders were exhausted. Few had slept well in days. The constant cannon fire and the fear of attack had worn them down. But when the bugles sounded and the drums rolled, they knew the moment had come. Muskets were loaded, cannons readied, and men rushed to the walls. The first wave of Mexican soldiers advanced quickly, but the defenders fired back with deadly precision. Muskets cracked, cannons roared, and men fell in heaps. The attackers stumbled over their dead and pressed forward again. Imagine being one of those soldiers, climbing over bodies while musket balls tore through the air. It was chaos, smoke, and blood. For a short time, the defenders held strong. Their gunfire broke up 2 charges. But numbers told the story. Santa Anna had thousands. The Alamo had fewer than 200. Once the ladders were raised and troops began scaling the walls, the outcome shifted. Defenders stabbed with bayonets, swung rifle butts, and fought hand to hand. But the walls were breached. On the north wall, attackers poured in. A cannon fired at close range, tearing into the Mexican ranks, but the defenders couldn't stop the flood. On the west, the defenses crumbled too. Soon the enemy was inside the compound, and the defenders fell back to the barracks and chapel. Picture the scene. Narrow rooms filled with smoke. Gunfire at point-blank range. Shouts in English and Spanish. Men fighting with knives, muskets, even bare hands. The defenders fought desperately, but they were outnumbered 20-1. Step by step, room by room, Santa Anna's troops pushed forward. The chapel became the last stronghold. Defenders barricaded doors, firing through cracks, refusing to surrender. But the attackers broke through. Some defenders fought to the very last shot. Others were bayonet where they stood. It was brutal, close, and final. The entire battle lasted less than 90 minutes. Think about that. 13 days of waiting ended in less than 2 hours of slaughter. By the time the sun rose higher, every defender was dead. Only women, children, and a handful of non-combatants survived. Santa Anna had his victory, but it came at a cost. Hundreds of his soldiers lay dead or wounded. The Alamo was taken, but the price was steep. Now here's something important. In this part, we will not explain the leader's last moments. You may be wondering, what about Crockett? What about Bowie? What about Travis? Those stories are coming in the next section. For now, focus on the battle itself, the fight as a whole, and the courage shown by nameless men whose stories were never told. Santa Anna ordered the bodies of the defenders burned. Piles of wood became funeral pyres. Smoke rose over San Antonio as a grim warning to anyone who dared resist him. He thought fear would break the rebellion. Instead, it fueled it. Survivors like Susanna Dickinson were sent out to spread the tale. Her words carried far and fast, telling Texans of the massacre. Have you ever noticed how sometimes victory plants the seed of defeat? That's what happened here. Santa Anna won the field, but he hardened Texian resolve. Remember the Alamo became a cry of vengeance. Men flocked to the Texian army, eager to avenge the dead. Within weeks, Santa Anna would face them at San Jacinto, and there, his army would crumble. But in the moment, on that March morning, all that mattered was survival, and survival was impossible. The defenders of the Alamo made their stand, fought their fight, and fell to the last man. The final assault on the Alamo was not long, but it was savage. It showed the courage of the few against the might of the many. It showed how far Santa Anna would go to crush rebellion. And it set the stage for what came next, the legend of the fallen leaders, and the question that still lingers. How did they really die? That is where we turn next, to the disputed last moments of Travis, Bowie, and Crockett. Their fates remain one of the great debates of the Wild West. Stay with us, because the story is about to get even more controversial. Part 5. The Leader's Last Moments. When the smoke cleared at the Alamo, nearly 200 defenders were dead. But what about the leaders everyone remembers? How exactly did Travis, Bowie, and Crockett meet their end? For almost 2 centuries, historians have argued about it. Were the heroic tales true, or were they polished into legend later? Recent studies and controversial theories give us new angles to consider. Let's start with William Barrett Travis. Most accounts agree that he died early in the final battle. He was only 26, commanding the Alamo despite his youth. Tradition says he was struck by a musket ball to the head while firing a cannon near the North Wall. His fall was said to inspire those around him. But is that the whole truth? Some Mexican accounts suggest Travis may have fought longer, struck down only after retreating inside. A few even claim he was killed by bayonet thrusts, not a bullet. The exact details are hazy, but all agree he fell near the start. Travis became the symbol of duty and sacrifice, cut down in the opening clash. Jim Bowie's fate is even murkier. By the time of the assault, Bowie was bedridden, likely suffering from tuberculosis or typhoid. Some legends say he was killed where he lay, pistols blazing until the end. Others describe Mexican soldiers dragging him from his bed and executing him. Recent studies of battle reports hint that Bowie may have been found alive but helpless, then finished off by bayonet. His large hunting knife, now famous as the Bowie knife, fueled the idea that he fought to the last breath. But modern historians argue that was more myth than fact. The evidence suggests Bowie was too sick to put up much resistance. Still, his name lives on as one of the fiercest fighters of the frontier. And now we come to Davy Crockett, the most debated of all. For generations, the story was simple. Crockett died heroically, rifle in hand, overwhelmed while defending the chapel. That version spread widely, especially in the United States, where Crockett was already a folk hero. But in the 1970s, historians uncovered Mexican officer accounts that tell a different story. These documents, known as the De La Pena Diary, claim Crockett and a small group surrendered after the battle. Santa Anna allegedly ordered their execution, and they were killed by sword or bayonet. If true, Crockett died not in glorious combat, but as a prisoner, cut down after surrendering. This theory caused an uproar. Many Texans rejected it outright, calling it an insult to Crockett's memory. Others argued the diary was authentic and provided a rare glimpse from the Mexican side. In recent decades, forensic experts and historians have studied the document's handwriting and paper. Most now believe it is genuine, but whether it is fully accurate remains uncertain. Some scholars point out that De La Pena may have exaggerated or invented details to criticize Santa Anna's cruelty. So, did Crockett die fighting or surrendering? We may never know. The debate continues, and emotions still run high. What about physical evidence? In 2014, archaeologists uncovered bone fragments near the Alamo site, sparking speculation they belonged to fallen defenders. Some hope DNA testing might link remains to Crockett or other leaders. But the findings were inconclusive, and the bones were later reburied without answers. It shows how difficult it is to solve mysteries from so long ago. Even today, the stories of these men stir strong feelings. For many Texans, the image of Crockett swinging Old Betsy, his rifle, until the last breath is untouchable. To suggest otherwise feels like tearing down a sacred myth. Yet history is rarely neat. It's messy, uncertain, and full of conflicting voices. Mexican officers recorded one truth. Texian survivors remembered another. Newspapers back in the U.S. printed their own versions. Which do we trust? Here's another layer. Some scholars argue that all three leaders' deaths were shaped more by politics than fact. In the weeks after the battle, Texian leaders needed martyrs. Travis became the brave commander. Bowie became the fierce fighter cut down in bed. Crockett became the heroic frontiersman, standing tall against impossible odds. These stories weren't just history. They were propaganda, meant to inspire more men to join the fight. And it worked. Remember, the Alamo carried more power with heroes than with messy details. But ask yourself, does it matter how they died, or that they died? Would Crockett's surrender, if true, erase his courage during the siege? Would Bowie's illness make him less committed to the cause? Would Travis's death by bayonet rather than bullet change his sacrifice? Maybe not. The legend and the reality both remind us that these men stood their ground when escape was possible. They chose to stay, and that choice sealed their fate. So where does that leave us? With Travis, the story is fairly consistent. With Bowie, we face uncertainty. And with Crockett, the debate rages hottest of all. Recent studies suggest surrender is possible, maybe even likely. But popular memory still clings to the last stand. Both versions carry weight. One shows unbending defiance. The other shows the cruelty of Santa Anna. Either way, Crockett's death became a spark that lit the Texian cause. Here's the final question for you. Do you prefer the legend or the history? Do you want your heroes to be flawless? Or are you willing to accept them as human, with all their weaknesses? At the Alamo, legend and fact blur together. The truth may be uncertain, but the impact is undeniable. Travis, Bowie, and Crockett died in different ways, but together, their sacrifice gave the Alamo its lasting meaning.